Hi Founder fans, Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day Week in Review, where I will discuss the last 7 articles published on my website, founderoftheday.com. Thank you all for rolling in. Matt, no critter problem this week. My chair's a little wrong. I just had a little bit of a conflict with a not so sleepy child, so I do apologize for the slight delay this time. Misfit, Ashley, Ginger, John, thank you all for coming so much. If you have any questions, let me know. We're going to hop right into it, though I did want to make sure you guys enjoyed the interview I did the other day with Jesse from the Schuyler Mansion, and wanted to let you know it shouldn't affect you guys too much because you already watch live, but I'm going to start doing more live videos. I might start going live pretty much every night about 8:15, if that's interesting to you. Starting with Monday, well, of course we'll have the trivia this Friday and the video on Sunday, but starting on Monday, where we'll have another interview with Michael Troy of the American Revolution podcast is coming back, and I'm very excited for that, and we're going to talk then about the Navy. But right now, let's get into the founders. I've wasted enough of your time, though. Also, there is the Discord link in the description below if you want to join our conversation. Outside of this, our first founder today is Solomon Bush. Now, Solomon Bush, I'm surprised I didn't know too much about. As many of you know, I am interested in the Jewish founders. There are more Jewish founders than the percentage of Jews in the population should warrant, but, the Jews really like the whole freedom of religion thing they were talking about back then. So Solomon Bush is a really interesting character. Bush was from a wealthy family. His father's name, I believe, was Mateus, is how it was pronounced, Bush. They were a wealthy family in Philadelphia. Solomon, he's a young man in his early 20s when he hears he sees the Declaration of Independence, and he likes what's going on, so he decides to join the war effort. And he joins up and he joins the Pennsylvania militia. And while he's in the Pennsylvania, easy for me to say, when he's in the Pennsylvania militia, he comes out as a part of the flying camp. And the flying camp is essentially like the Minutemen were in other colonies of the United States. But they were supposed to just move at any minute and be the first ones to respond to any acts of aggression. Now, this happens to affect Solomon Bush's life when, after the Battle of Brandywine, he doesn't actually participate in Brandywine. I don't believe so, but there are some skirmishes afterwards during which he's wounded. He's shot in the thigh. He's hurt. Now, he does survive this, but it would take him about 2 years to recover from this really significant injury. However, he didn't have that kind of time because he was brought to his father's house outside of Philadelphia and just a few days later was captured by the British Army. And General Howe seems to have used his house for at least part of a day as a temporary headquarters. And while he's there, he hears someone come in and talk to Howe. Now, the description of this person is vague and we don't know who it is, but he hears this person say to Howe about information coming from Washington's headquarters. And again, just to be clear, this is General Howe is not the Robert Howe of the Continental Army. It's the General Howe running the British Army. And the person brings Howe information coming from Washington's headquarters. So it seems like there's a leak coming from the very tippy top inside. Now, somehow, despite his injury, Solomon Bush is able to escape, and he talks to General John Armstrong Sr., Jr. would also participate in the revolution, but he talks to General Armstrong Sr., and General Armstrong then writes a letter to George Washington saying, hey, Mr. Washington, Mr. General, President General, soon to be President, the George Washington, hey, Washington, there's a spy in your midst. Now, I looked as far as I could to find a spy being outed, and this is in December of 1777, just as they're going into their winter quarters at Valley Forge. So, literally the day he's going into Valley Forge. So, yeah. Again, I looked as hard as I could to see if there was a spy. I could not find them outing anyone in Washington's family there. But this was pretty much the major role that Bush would play. I will say he would serve time as a deputy adjutant general in the Pennsylvania militia, which adjutant generals, they deal with the business of running the war. Yes, Matt, that letter does still exist. I'm pretty sure in the article I published I think I put a link. I've been really trying to like put links to help people further their research, as well as, you know, I should have been using footnotes this whole time. I've usually leave like a book, or, you know, if you look at the footnotes section of my website, it's like essentially Founders Online is where I confirm all the stories I hear. But I do believe that the letter from John Armstrong to George Washington, yes, does exist. I did read it. I'm pretty sure it's the one I linked to in the article. I could actually, you know what? It's right here. Let me see. No, of course I didn't leave it in this article. What am I? You know, I talk a big game and just screw it up. You know, Matt, I will send you that letter. It's really interesting. Anyway, Bush is not done, because Solomon Bush goes on to, after the war is over, he ends up going to London, where he ends up working as a physician, even though he had no medical training. It just seems like he picked up over the years how to be a doctor. So he goes to London and is like, yeah, I'm a doctor. And everyone's like, okay, cool. Which, from like in colonial society and in early America, that makes sense. Most doctors didn't have any formal training. But in London, where like people went to become doctors, I'm gonna fix this. Kill me. That seems kind of off to me, but well, whatever. He did. And he worked as a physician for several years. And then he kind of imposes himself as a diplomat. At one point, an American ship is captured because the British, as they were wont to do at the time, accused the ship of having deserted British soldiers now working on the ship. And since it took a long time to send messages across the sea, Solomon Bush did jump in and cool the tensions there. He wrote to George Washington, who like thanked him for his help, but was like, kind of, stop it, man. And eventually he does. Solomon Bush does return to the United States. He always couldn't find work. Most of the letters I read, actually, Matt, and everyone, were him trying to get official government positions from Washington, and Washington kind of being like, nah, thanks, man. No, we're good right now. And he tried to get work at the Port of Philadelphia. Several jobs. He does, like I said, it seemed like he came back and worked as a physician, essentially, which you didn't have to be a real trained doctor to do at the time. But he spends the rest of his life working as a physician and trying to get federal appointments that he just never gets. He would just, there's like letter after letter to George Washington of him just trying to get a federal appointment. And it never seems to happen. So let's move on to our next article. As everyone watching probably knows, each week I publish a review of a Federalist paper. Nope. Well, I did that for a year and a half, and now I'm doing anti-Federalist papers. Right now we're going through the papers of Brutus, probably arguably the most important anti-Federalist of his time, or of any time, I guess. And right now we're up to Brutus number 6, week 6 of covering Brutus. Now, this one I titled Taxing the States Out of Existence. Though, as I've mentioned before, Brutus didn't really title his papers. They're either letters 1, 2, 3, 4, or essays 1, 2, 3, 4. I've seen them written as both, but it's not even 1, 2, 3, 4. It's I, V. Now, this one comes out December 27th, 1787, and I'm sure this dude was not a lot of fun to talk to that Christmas because he was writing about how terrible this new government was going to be. He really focuses in number 6. He just keeps expanding on what he's been talking about the last few weeks, to be honest, which is the use of the necessary and proper clause and the power of taxation to destroy the states. Now, he goes into pretty interesting detail on this one, however. First of all, he says, if the federal government wants to raise the most money, then they're going to need to tax the products that are used the most. And as we did mention last week, I believe it was, they could tax things that weren't necessary for survival, but had become so commonplace in society that they were essentially necessary. Kind of like the Stamp Act was for when the colonies revolted against the British. You don't need stamps. You don't need to buy a house to get the stamp on the deed, but you kind of did. And this is what he's saying. And essentially, Brutus says they're going to be spending so much on... they can tax so many things that eventually either the people will go broke or either the federal government or the state governments will have to stop taxing so the other one can take over and do all the taxing. And one or the other will work. He actually uses the biblical quote. Where is it? The biblical quote: "No man can serve two masters." And he actually says, quote, "The one power or the other must prevail, or else they will destroy each other." And this is implying that either you're going to tax the people till they're all broke, and it'll become tyranny, or they'll all revolt. Eventually, the federal government will have to make necessary and proper laws to either assume the states entirely or ban the states from taxation. Hi, TJ, thanks for coming. Or anything of that nature. So, this is not going to go very good, as he predicts. And I do want to note, he actually goes into very important detail on what will be taxed and his fears, and he goes right to ciders, in a whole paragraph about ciders, and then he goes to another tax about porter, ale, and malt liquors. I'm sure whiskey does count as a malt liquor. He doesn't outright say whiskey, although whiskey would be heavily taxed pretty much right away by the Washington administration, and a whole uprising would explode. Just really as Brutus predicted. And it keeps going, again, really thick detail, and I'm not going into all the detail, although I will say he goes off on a big tangent about how it would affect people's lives. He talks about it following your servants, it'll be in your wine cellars, it'll follow your wives into the bathroom. I'm paraphrasing, but literally exactly what he said. Is something like the ladies to the powder room. I forget exactly his 18th century phraseology, but it's a long paragraph about every which way it's going to follow. These taxes will follow you, which is interesting. And there's, I suppose you could say, a lot of truth to that now. Now, of course, most of you know over the weekends, I go and I publish older articles because I take the weekends off, and I publish articles from my extensive collection. And this weekend I first published about William Temple Franklin, who was one of Ben Franklin's grandsons, who has a role in the American Revolution. Now, this particular William Franklin, Benjamin's grandson, he was excuse my language, I suppose, but technically the bastard son of the bastard son of Benjamin Franklin. His father was William Franklin, who was the son of Benjamin Franklin and the royal governor of New Jersey, and many of you will know, a loyalist. Now, William Temple was not a loyalist. William Temple actually accompanied his grandfather to France and was his personal secretary during essentially the entire time Ben Franklin was Ben Franklining over in France and trying to get France on our side to fight in the war, and then trying to get the Treaty of Paris negotiated. And William Temple Franklin was there during the negotiations of the Treaty of Paris. Now, he was not an official delegate or representative of the United States of America, but he was working as the secretary and the clerk and doing the bookworks for not just Benjamin Franklin, but once John Jay comes from Spain and John Adams comes back from the Netherlands, and Henry Lawrence, who was also not an official representative, but Henry Lawrence comes from the Tower of London. William Temple Franklin is doing all the grunt work during the negotiations of the Treaty of Paris, and he's there when it's signed. Arguably, he was the first person to know about peace, other than the delegation itself. Well, he and Henry Lawrence, technically, were just there hanging out. Yes, you like that, Ashley? Yes. While Ben Franklin was doing the Ben Franklining, and John Adams was Adamsing, and John Jay was John Jaying. Franklining works the best. I like to call him Benny Franks a lot, but in hindsight, there are other founding fathers with the name Franks, like David Franks. Again, another Jewish founding father, so I shouldn't call him Benny Franks too much. He does a lot of Ben Franklin. So, Treaty of Paris, great. War's all done. Benny Franks wants to go home. He's all done with this being... Just as a reminder, Ben Franklin was in Europe with the exception of about a year and a half coming home. He was in London for 20 years. during which time he comes home for about a year and a half. Then after London, he comes home for about a year and a half, and then goes to France. So for almost the entirety of 30 years, Ben Franklin was in Europe. And he's done after the Treaty of Paris. He wants to come back, be president of Pennsylvania for a while, and he does. So William Temple Franklin has all this experience learning from the best, carrying the last name of the best, and he petitions Continental Congress to say, hey, can I take over as Secretary of France now that we're an independent nation and Grandpa wants to go home? And the Continental Congress says, well, you're still talking to your dad, right? You know, that loyalist William Franklin who used to be Royal Governor of New Jersey. And William Temple's like, sometimes, not often. I talk to Grandpa a lot more. Just work for Grandpa. Grandpa's going to vouch for me. Johnny Adams is going to vouch for me. John Jay's going to vouch for me. And they're like, yeah, but, you know, now that Thomas Jefferson turned us down, but now that his wife died, he wants to get out of town. We're gonna send Thomas Jefferson. You know, in hindsight, we look back and it's like, yeah, of course Thomas Jefferson took over for Ben Franklin, but like, no, it wasn't. Of course, this other guy, William Temple Franklin, was only a few years younger than Jefferson, wanted to do more, but no, unfortunately for him, fortunately probably for the rest of us, Thomas Jefferson took over. William Temple comes back to the United States, but he just doesn't see a lot of opportunity for himself here. So he ends up going back to Europe. He's here for, I keep saying a year and a half, but he's back in the United States for like a year and a half, 2 years, and then ends up going back to Europe for the remainder of his life, never to return to the United States. He's there. He does work for Robert Morris for a while as an agent for Robert Morris's international conglomerate corporation. He ends up... unfortunately, he's not great with money. So he ends up splurging on most of his finances and ends up dying in Paris. I mean, a few decades later, he lives for a while, but he dies nearly penniless in Paris. And extra sad is he was the only son or grandson of Benjamin Franklin, who carried the name Franklin, and he had no sons of his own. So with him, the name Franklin did pass away, at least relating directly to Benjamin Franklin. Though, I do want to say on a high note, Benjamin Franklin, when he died, left his papers to William Temple Franklin, and William Temple is the one who first published the Franklin papers. So we do have the writings of Benjamin Franklin thanks to William Temple Franklin, and honestly, it's arguable that that's a more important part of the American founding than even his role in the Treaty of Paris. Actually, yes, you should start making their... I like to make everyone's name into verbs in my everyday life, so... that's neither here nor there. Let's continue on. Take one quick sip of this liquid. We're going to talk about James Warren. So, James Warren, you might notice the name pretty quickly. He was a distant cousin of Joseph Warren, very distant, and he was the spouse of probably a more famous wife, Mercy Otis Warren, who was famous in her own time for her publications. She was one of the first women in the young United States to publish under her own name. And although she did publish a lot under pseudonyms, especially early in her career, she would end up being publishing an early history of the United States, yada, yada, yada. And James Warren is the one who gave her the nickname, his scribbler. She was a scribbler. So throwing that out there, a little bonus founder for Mercy Otis today. However, James Warren was an important founder in his own right. He was an early advocate with people like Sam Adams, John Adams, Joseph Hawley, Joseph Warren, as we said. He was one of those early shouters and rabble-rousers in Boston leading up to the Revolution. Once the Revolution breaks out, James does join the colonial militia, and he fights in the battle... Oh, cat just kicked open the door and scared the life out of me. Anyway, James Warren served in the colonial militia. He fights in the Battle of Bunker Hill. While he's at Bunker Hill, his distant cousin Joseph Warren is killed, and Joseph Warren was at the time serving as the president of the Provincial Congress of Massachusetts, aka the shadow government that took over during the Revolution. No, I won't be able to catch the cat, Ashley. Nice try. I wish, though. I would. Joseph dies, and James Warren takes over, and yeah, she comes in every time, right? Terrible. And the problem is, if I block the door so it doesn't open, then she'll, like, scratch on it, and it'll be even worse. We'll be standing here listening to that. Anyway, now that the cat's ruined everyone's unsubscribed because of my kitten. The greatest cat in the world. No, my cat's name is Harvest, which part of me was, in hindsight, if I had a daughter, I would love that name for a little girl, or a big woman also, but either way. Yeah, she wants to learn about the Rev War. The other cat's name is Boston, funny enough, but my spouse brought that into my life, so that cat's not as sweet. Anyway, back to the Revolution. James Warren, this guy, takes over for Joseph Warren, a distant cousin, as president of the Provincial Congress, which was essentially, as I was saying, running the shadow government. She kicked in the door when I was saying the word shadow government, so maybe I thought the feds were out to get me. The Provincial Congress, which ran the Massachusetts government until 1780, when the Massachusetts First Constitution was accepted by the people. Now, that's a 5-year period where James Warren essentially ran Massachusetts during wartime. Although, of course, after about a year, the war did travel away from Massachusetts and didn't really come back. I guess there were things in Maine going on that was technically Massachusetts, but so he's trying to help build Massachusetts. He does serve on the committee that writes the first Constitution. He's also elected as a major general in the state militia. He led men on several occasions, though he actually resigns his commission kind of in disgust, and we've come into this issue with other founders in the past, where he was a major general in the state militia, and the Continental Army expected him to follow the orders of a sergeant or an ensign. The lowest level officer in the Continental Army technically was supposed to have higher rank than a major general running the entirety of Massachusetts state militia. And as I've said many times on this channel, the militias were technically separate armies entirely. They usually defaulted to George Washington's wishes, but didn't mean you're going to default to the wishes of a nobody who's like way down here in the Continental Army. So far down it's not even on camera in the Continental Army. Joseph Warren resigns this, as many people did. He resigns over this and sends a long letter to John Adams, who at the time was still in the Continental Congress, and explains himself. This is garbage, what's going on here. And what's really interesting, and there's a book called Stark, about General John Stark, and it goes into an interesting detail in this. This book talks about, really, John Stark in two parts, the French and Indian War and then the Revolutionary War. And one of the things in the French and Indian War that were, one of the things for the French and Indian War, the colonial militias fought with the British Army. In the Revolutionary War, the state militias were fighting with the Continental Army, and the Continental Army looked down on them. But just 15, 20 years beforehand, the colonial militias, the same militias, people like George Washington, went and fought with the British Army, and the British Army looked down on them. So Joseph Warren has exactly the same complaint about the James Warren has exactly the same complaint about the Continental Army that George Washington did about the British Army. And many other people had the same complaints, and it was one of the, as we say, the long list of indignities that led the colonies to rebel against the mother country. This was one of them. It's one of the lesser ones, and it's certainly overlooked, but we just run right back into it. George out there, yes, Ginger, George out there, Washingtoning. Washing. No, I can't abbreviate. I want to squish it together. Anywho, so that's essentially it for James Warren. He does end up being an important anti-federalist, but he and unfortunately, because he had resigned his commission in the militia, and he was against the federal government, and then Massachusetts becomes pretty heavily federalist. He kind of steps out of the public spotlight from there. Also, he's writing anti-federalist, and his wife, as I said, Mercy Otis Warren, also starts publishing in her own name. She writes a history of the United States and talks a lot of trash about the John Adams, and she was a good friend of both John and Abigail Adams, so this kind of destroys that relationship for a long time. So, James Warren, excuse me. So let's move right along here and talk about Isaac Shelby. Now I'm going to take a sip of this because I'm choking on myself. Now, Isaac Shelby, I got to give a shout out to the History Nuts and the Kentucky History Podcast. They invited me on last Thursday onto their show. They did a Facebook live stream, which I have a link to in my article, and the link down below. If you click on my article, right at the top, there's another link to that. I went on there expecting to talk about Kentucky history. We did a little bit, but they asked me a lot about me, which was harder to answer, I suppose. It's a lot of fun, so definitely check it out. And if you like Kentucky history in particular, check them out, man. A lot of fun stuff over there. And I was kind of prepared with a few founders to talk about, and then they asked me about Isaac Shelby, and I was like on the spot, and I knew who Isaac Shelby was, I just didn't know anything about him, and I got kind of twisted over myself, because they said he was in the war, and I was like, but Kentucky, I thought he was governor, and the little dude's audio wasn't great. Oh, Jameson, well, he's a super nice guy, and, we're figuring it out over here, but thank you for watching, Matt. I do appreciate it. As you saw me choke on Isaac Shelby. So I felt really embarrassed because Isaac Shelby was the first governor of Kentucky. And this was during a time, during the George Washington administration. I should know all the governors, you would think, although there were a lot of them, to be fair. But Isaac Shelby was a lot more than that. So let's talk about him. Now I know a ton about him, and I will never forget again. But he was born in Maryland, but grew up in Virginia, spent most of his time in the Virginia militia. He went with his father out to the frontier over the Appalachian Mountains, created a... I did say hit nail on the hammer. I found myself saying that recently a few times. I'm not entirely sure why, but that's the thing now. It's the J Mandrashing is when you swap them in SWIP. Like, I find myself saying chat chit a lot instead of chit chat, so... Anyway, Isaac Shelby goes out with his dad to the frontier. They build a trading post. They're there for a few years, burns down, and then they join the Virginia militia in Dunmore's War. And Dunmore's War is a really fascinating little fight with the Native Americans in the Ohio Valley. Because they're sent by Lord Dunmore, who's royal governor of Virginia, in the fall of 1774, which if that time frame rings a bell, it's because they are fighting a war against Native Americans on behalf of the royal governor of Virginia, but in their minds for the colony of Virginia, as the First Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia. They are not that, a few hundred miles away on, like, the border of Pennsylvania, basically. The other side, like, not far from Pittsburgh, and they're over in Philadelphia, First Continental Congressing, and they're over here fighting the Native Americans. And there's not too many big battles in there, but, the I don't know what to call them, the British, I almost said the Patriots, then I almost said the Americans, but no, they were technically British. The Virginia militiamen did a good job. They pretty much win the war. It's hard to even call it a war. It was more like one big battle with a lot of skirmishes surrounding it. And then they come back, and most of those people say, okay, yeah, we'll join the Revolutionary War, sure. And he does. And Isaac Shelby ends up becoming an important general in the Virginia militia. He goes all over the place, Throughout the southern half of the war, an important member of the much overlooked western theater of the war. His biggest battle is the Battle of Kings Mountain, which he is one of the leaders of. Pretty much I'm pretty sure he's the highest ranking general there, but I'm not entirely sure about that because there are, several different armies working together, technically, with the different militias coming together, but he leads them to victory. He uses a tactic called Indian play, which, someone left me a message somewhere. I can't remember if it was on Twitter or Facebook, or sent me an email. Someone left me a message about Indian play. There's another name for it, and now I'm really embarrassed. I meant to bring it to you guys. I feel like an idiot. But essentially what it was is he was copying what Native Americans would do, where they would hide behind a tree and fire, and then they'd run up to the next tree, load their gun, and then fire, or maybe they'd load their gun, run to the next tree, and then fire, and that's how you'd advance up the hill. And they advanced and took a fort that they really should not have taken. Truthfully, part of it is the fault of the gentleman who was defending the fort with the British. Should have done a better job defending this pretty much impenetrable fort, but they took it. And Isaac Shelby spends the rest of his life with the nickname, because this is when they start giving out fun nicknames, especially in the South. That Andrew Jackson would soon become Old Hickory. Isaac Shelby gets the nickname Old Kings Mountain, because, they named him after the mountain. Anyway, as the war ends, I should say, during this time, Shelby is elected to first the Virginia and then later the North Carolina assemblies. So he serves in both Virginia and North Carolina's government. He's also appointed by Richard Caswell as a magistrate in the Kentucky-Tennessee area, which was, some people thought was North Carolina. Some people might have called it Virginia. Some people called it Franklin for a while there. So he's there, and he becomes really important in the movement towards statehood. And I passed by the 1780s entirely in my article, pretty much. But there are a bunch of conventions called to organize the territory of Kentucky. And he goes to most of them, and eventually he goes to the one where they write a constitution to submit to the United States. They had to write a constitution and verify they had, I think it was 30,000 residents, and submit that to the United States. And then they do in 1794 or 5, Kentucky becomes a state. It's a little earlier than that. It's after Vermont. They wait for Vermont. But Kentucky, what's interesting is just 30 years before this, Kentucky had 500 people in the entire county of Kentucky. And here we are, in 30 years, that's now 30,000 plus people. And they become a state. And when Kentucky becomes a state, they elect Isaac Shelby as their first governor. So Shelby has a ton to do as the first governor. He has to literally organize the whole state. He has to... he participates to a lesser degree than others in the Northwest Indian War, which at the time was still raging, though coming to an end. He would help raise money and troops and supplies to assist Mad Anthony Wayne in finishing the job in the Northwest Territory and ending that war. And he would also become a part of the Citizen Genet affair. Now, Citizen Genet, I should probably write about. He was the representative of revolutionary France to the United States of America. So he's the one that France, while they're going through the reign of terror and just beheading each other all over the place, he's the one who's fortunate enough to get out and go represent whoever ends up in charge to the United States. Now, while he's there, he's a pretty radical person, and Genet has a few other people working for him in his legation, and they come in. While Genet is giving George Washington trouble in, at the time, Philadelphia, some of his people go out west and go to Kentucky. Some of them even meet directly with Isaac Shelby, because they had a letter of introduction from the ambassador from France. So while he's there, essentially these men are trying to convince Shelby to raise an army to help them invade Spanish Louisiana, which is essentially at the time everything over the Mississippi. And if you know a little bit about geography, Kentucky touches the Mississippi. And to be fair, Kentucky wanted access to the Mississippi. And in the 1780s, as we talked about a few months ago with Gardoqui, the Spanish minister, in his negotiations with Jay, Spain had cut off any access to the Mississippi River from the people of Kentucky. And now again, just before Kentucky, just as Kentucky's becoming a state, you have the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794, the same time period. And a large reason for the Whiskey Rebellion is all these farmers on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains were growing all this wheat and rye and grains, and they wanted to ship it down the Mississippi so they could sell it to the world. But the Mississippi was cut off, so they started making it into whiskey. And because whiskey lasted longer, and they could transport whiskey over the mountains. Also, they were getting taxed heavier than the big corporations on the coast that could make whiskey easier. But I bring this all up because that's the situation that Shelby finds himself in as the first governor of Kentucky. He has these Frenchmen coming saying, hey, all the people here, because most of the citizens of Kentucky would happily have gone to war with Spain. These are former soldiers in the Continental Army who have been paid in land, traveled over the mountains to settle this land they were paid in. They're growing this whiskey. They're growing these wheat. They can't sell it, and they have to make it into whiskey, and now they're being taxed super heavy. And the whole reason they can't, they're in this terrible situation is because Spain won't let them sail down the river. So you got this French guy coming in saying, hey, let's go fight them. And they're like, yeah. And to be fair, about a decade later, Aaron Burr would shoot Alexander Hamilton and flee to this area and say exactly the same thing. Hey, why don't we go invade Spain and reclaim the river? Now, Burr's an exception. He was accused of trying to start his own nation and becoming an emperor. That's, undecided. Neither here nor there. The point is, these tensions were real. So Shelby is here. These people are talking to him, and he's trying to be a moderate. He doesn't want to start a war. He's trying to start a state. And he's getting letters in the mail from, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. And I didn't read of one directly from George Washington, but, everyone in the Washington administration. Henry Knox, that's the other one. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of War Henry Knox, writing letter after letter to Shelby saying, don't. And it's interesting because Thomas Jefferson got a little bit of a bad rap in the Washington administration for being more friendly with Citizen Genet because he was more in favor of the French Revolution. He's the one who is saying, let's go help Lafayette, let's send troops over there. But at the same time, he's saying, don't start a war with Spain. We don't want a war in North America. We want to go fight in Europe. So, fortunately, Shelby is able to walk this line in the middle until tensions cool themselves. Essentially, he ends up getting these letters, and he's able to calm the guys. The gentlemen in Kentucky are not raising as much hell as the Citizen Genet is actually in Philadelphia, in the capital. So he's able to cool the people in his area pretty good. And then, he's governor for 4 years, and then he retires for 15 years. And he just, he's active in local life. He's active in building Kentucky, but he's not in charge of anything. Until 15 years later, almost 20 years later, the War of 1812 breaks out. The War of 1812 is a big deal because everyone comes back to Shelby. And they're like, hey, Shelby, can you be governor again? He's like, no, dude, no. And then even the guy who's running for governor comes up to him and is like, listen, if you're going to run, I don't want to run against you. You can just have it. And he's kind of fine. And he does. And then he plays a really, really important role recruiting soldiers from Kentucky and sending them to General William Henry Harrison, up in the northern part of the Americas, fighting Canada, which was British at the time. And additionally, eventually, he gets enough requests from William Henry Harrison where Isaac Shelby raises, as governor of Kentucky, raises a 3,500-man army and leads them himself to war and helps win with William Henry Harrison the Battle of the Thames. And that's a major turning point, a major victory for the Americans in the War of 1812. Now, after this, he's like, I'm going to retire again. And Shelby goes home to retire. And he's asked he's floated by the Democratic Republicans. He's associated with the Democratic Republicans by this point, and he's asked to be the nominee for vice president to run with James Monroe. And he declines. He would have won. Interestingly enough, this is a point in time where almost every vice president is from New York. And they actually consider this gentleman for his role in expanding the nation, creating states, and winning wars. They ask him to be vice president. And he says no, he declines. And then James Monroe becomes president, so Monroe calls him up, or does, ring, ring, hey, call him from the future, I got a phone. He writes him, and he actually nominates Shelby to be Secretary of War, thinking, this isn't so much work. And Shelby again is like, no, man, I'm all done, thanks. And he turns down being Secretary of War in the Monroe administration. Fascinating guy. I can't believe how little I actually knew about him before I did this research, but that's why I do it. So, I'm going to take a sip of water and say, speaking of William Henry Harrison... Oh, who's that? Look at that. Oh, God, what do you know? It's William Henry Harrison. Can't imagine. Imagine that. Guys, hit like while you're here. William Henry Harrison. His name came up a little bit just now. When you think William Henry Harrison, you probably don't think much at all. And when you do think of him, you say, that's the guy who had the shortest presidency. And, like, you're not wrong. But this guy wasn't just like, hey, I bet you that guy's going to die soon. We should make him president real quick. That's not how it went down. William Henry Harrison had a long train of successes in his career to be not only elected president, but he would actually be elected president. It would be Andrew Jackson for a whole handful of years, and then Martin Van Buren didn't have such a good time, and then William Henry Harrison ran on Tippecanoe and Tyler too. But also he ran on like I'm the next Andrew Jackson campaign, and in a lot of ways he was. Hit like or fish shovels. I think what you mean is get a John Paul Jonesing, Ashley. Is that not the joke of the day? So, we need to talk about William Henry Harrison in his youth. Because, much like Andrew Jackson, and we talked about Henry Clay not long ago, he was a part of the American founding. But his most important roles were during the age of Jackson. William Henry Harrison, like Andrew Jackson, has an age of Jackson named after him. So, he can't be from two ages, right? Like, it's one or the other. When we're reading history books, you have to choose a side. Technically, William Henry Harrison's presidency was then, but most of what William Henry Harrison did actually was during the American Revolution and the American founding itself. So, when William Henry Harrison was 3 years old, his father Benjamin signed the Declaration of Independence. Again, he's a little younger than most of the founders we talk about. But he comes from a family whose daddy signed the Declaration of Independence. Harrison goes on to grow up, and he ends up going to the College of Philadelphia College. At that point, I believe had been renamed to University of Pennsylvania. I'm not sure exactly when the renaming was, though. And he goes there to study at the medical school. And his father passes away. He was one of the younger kids his father had. And his father passes away. And William Henry goes, whoopsie daisy. And turns out his father didn't save quite enough money to put him through medical school. Now, William Henry was actually staying with Robert Morris at the time. And Robert Morris sent him to speak with his father's friend, Richard Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee. So these are his advisors. These gigantic names of the American Revolution are the men advising him. And they recommend he join the army. And he agrees. And he starts a career in the army. And yes, Matt, They Might Be Giants is fantastic. Side note, They Might Be Giants is fantastic. Their Science is Real is the best kids album. They have other kids albums that just aren't quite as good. But Science is Real is a lot of fun. We listen to it several days a week in this house. Thank you for bringing up They Might Be Giants. I appreciate it. I don't know if I've played Tippecanoe and Tyler 2, so I should play it for my kids. For some reason, it comes on the rotation. The Communists have the music, which again, the communists didn't have music, but that's not the point. Communists really regulated their music. It's in jest. Anyway, William Henry Harrison, he ends up going to the frontier to be a soldier, and he goes to the Northwest Territory. And again, this is just about the time he was just about 18 years old when William Shelby was becoming governor of Kentucky, and Mad Anthony Wayne is fighting in the Northwest Indian War. And William Henry Harrison, through his connections at 18 years old, goes west and becomes an aide-de-camp to Mad Anthony Wayne himself during the Northwest Indian War. After that, well before he hits in his early 20s, he starts serving as secretary to the Northwest Territory. And then, before he's even 30 years old, William Henry Harrison is sent as the Northwest Territory's representative to the United States House of Representatives. Now, it is similar to what Washington, D.C. has right now, where he is a member of the House of Representatives, but he cannot vote, but he can participate in debate, he can bring bills to the floor to be voted on, and he can serve on committees. It's literally everything else except fighting the war. Anyway, fighting the war. What am I saying? He did everything except vote. Man, my brain just died for a second there. He could do everything except vote. And now, shortly after his 27th birthday, he's already served in the House of Representatives for a year and a half. He's chosen by President John Adams. So we're in the American founding still. He's chosen by President John Adams to be first governor of the newly formed Indiana Territory. What's interesting is, in anticipation of Ohio becoming a state, they split the territory in half, and then the Indiana Territory was both north and west of the Northwest Territory, which then became Ohio pretty much. Either way, I just thought that was curious. He goes out there, he spends 12 years as governor of the Ohio Territory. He does a ton of making it a state. He has a whole slew of treaties he negotiates with the Native Americans. Because again, this is, by now several years have passed, but it's only about 5 or 6 years after the Northwest Indian War had ended. So he goes out and he's making treaties and negotiating with all these different tribes, trying to bring peace to the area, which he does successfully. And I saw some arguments during my research on this article that, he is the single most important figure in the development of not necessarily the Midwest, but the Northwest, the Ohio region, basically everything from Indiana through Wisconsin and through North Dakota. I can't get the map in my head. What's in between Wisconsin and North Dakota? Missouri, Montana. They have the Minnesota Wild. Okay, in Minnesota, that whole area is essentially this one man. A lot of it falls on his shoulders. We did talk about John Gibson, who was his secretary a few weeks back, another very important person. But he's up there, and then while he's there, his personal fortune is tied to the development of this area because he's invested so heavily in it. He does have kind of a crappy reputation on slavery. He actually was trying to bring slavery to the Northwest Territory. What's interesting that I read too is he's sent out as territorial governor, and his finances and his whole livelihood is tied to driving Indiana towards statehood. And while this drive is going on, he wants to populate it and make it valuable, and he thinks slave labor would be the easiest and most cost-effective way to do this, which objectively is true, but, slavery is beat. And most of the people who were moving to Indiana at the time thought slavery was stupid and wouldn't want it to come. And they didn't want it to come. And interestingly, as territorial governor, Harrison had, dictatorial powers. Not that he operated in that fashion, but he could do anything he wanted. He appointed all the judges, he appointed representatives, he just ran the whole place. But as they moved towards statehood, as we said before with Isaac Shelby, it was necessary to start making it, writing a constitution and making it, not technically democratic, but more republic in nature. And so they did that. And by 1812, after 12 years of this, they finally are on their way to statehood. Everything's getting set up, and the War of 1812 breaks out. And who takes over? Well, William Henry Harrison. And William Henry Harrison is known as Tippecanoe because he wins the Battle of Tippecanoe, which is the most famous one. But William Henry Harrison is one of, if not the, maybe after Winifred Scott, most important generals in winning the War of 1812 with Britain. I know that Andrew Jackson gets a lot of credit, but his big Battle of New Orleans was technically after the war was already over, though I am going to give him a shout out. Oh, thanks for the reminder, Matt. I will get to that. You know what, if we stick around at the end of this video, there's a lot to say about the heritage of William Henry Harrison. Excuse me. So, that's pretty much the end of the founding era. After this, Harrison moves to Ohio for a while. And then, he serves as a U.S. Senator. He ends up being a diplomat to South America for a few years, the Grand Columbia, I believe it was called, which was kind of during the revolutions that happened in South America. And then he comes back and, becomes president. But like that, again, his presidency, it's weird because his presidency is so short. Because he's really old at that point, but most of what he did, he was younger. Like his time in the War of 1812, he was born in 1773, so he's like 49? No. 39 when the War of 1812 breaks out. 39 years old, he's already served 12 years as territorial governor. He's already served 2 years as a representative in the House of Representatives. Already fought in, helped win the Northwest Indian War. So, like, he's almost more founder than Andrew Jackson is. And he's president after Andrew Jackson. Same thing with John Quincy Adams. I mean, John Quincy Adams has been another, 20 years after his presidency in the House of Representatives. It's very interesting. It's very interesting. So, I'm going to come back to Harrison's family as a little fun wrap-up at this one. Excuse me, I'm sorry. And Tippecanoe and Tyler, too, actually was not only a great... I like your Harrisoning reference, but not only was it a great campaign slogan, it was one of the first. So, when Andrew Jackson runs for president, and we're getting a little out of the founding here, but when Andrew Jackson ran for president, I think it was the second time, Martin Van Buren really came up with the political machine as we know it today. Aaron Burr kind of started it with Tammany Hall, and who came to politics in Tammany Hall? Martin Van Buren. And then he went on to really learn campaigning. So it was when, right after him, Harrison starts running. He's like, well, this is working. We got to do this. And that's why they come up with Tippecanoe and Tyler 2 as a slogan. Because and additionally, I believe... I should have listened to it first. I think the Tippecanoe and Tyler 2 song Matt was referencing from They Might Be Giants, I think that's actually his campaign song. There were a few. He wasn't the first with a campaign song, but, that's when it was getting hot. But we're going to pop over and do one last founder, and then I'm going to come back and talk about Harrison's family, which is not American Revolution, but it's amazing. And we're going to talk about Nabby Smith, Abigail Amelia Adams, the daughter of Abigail Adams Smith. This is a little tricky because John Adams had a wife whose maiden name was Smith, Abigail Smith, and a daughter named Abigail Adams who married a William Smith unrelated. So his wife's maiden name was Abigail Smith, and his daughter's married name was Abigail Smith. But this Abigail is known as Nabby, and her life was a little bit tragic, unfortunately. She was born, she's the oldest one of Abigail and John Adams' children. She grows up, she gets engaged to a guy named Royal Tyler. I think I made a video about Royal Tyler a few months back. He would later serve in the Revolution and go on to be a playwright, one of the first playwrights in New York City. Not necessarily a Broadway playwright, but a playwright in New York City. Very briefly, he wrote 1, maybe 2 plays, then moves away. But they fall in love when they're young. Unfortunately, although it takes a while, eventually their parents do consent to the marriage. But Nabby rides with her mother to meet her father in Europe, just as John Adams is going to meet the king and be the first minister to Great Britain. Now, this is a long-distance relationship, and then as now, it just didn't seem to work out. So, Nabby and Royal Tyler, their marriage doesn't happen. They break up. While she's there, she meets and falls in love with one of John Adams' secretary, a man named William Stephen Smith, who I thought I wrote about a long time ago and didn't. He is going to be tomorrow's article, and we will talk about him next week. Let's put him aside for now, because his life is crazy. But essentially, they get married. Her father becomes president, and as the oldest daughter, George Washington didn't have any children of his own. Martha did have a daughter, who I guess you could call first daughter, but Abigail, Nabby Adams Smith is kind of the first daughter in the history of the United States. Now, she plays zero role in the administration. She doesn't even seem to be in Philadelphia at all, not for any real amount of time, and I don't know if she ever makes it to Washington when John and Abigail moved out there. I didn't see that. Truth be told, I didn't look very hard into what she was doing during the administration because she just didn't have a role. She moves to central New York, not too far from where I live, actually, for a while. Her spouse isn't super great with money. Again, we'll get to it next week. And they end up living on a relatively small, modest farm. Not too far away from me. Although, you know what? In hindsight, she might be buried not far from here. Time out. No, she's not. No, she's not. Because I'm going to finish the story. Why would I stop telling my story? Because I know where she's buried. I think her husband's buried by me. I don't care. It doesn't matter. So, anyway. They live in New York for a while, and then, unfortunately, she develops breast cancer. And she moves to Massachusetts. Lebanon. They were living in, it's called Lebanon, New York in Madison County. It's not super close, probably an hour from here, but closer than some of these people. Anyway, she develops breast cancer. She goes back to her parents' house and has an operation that I'm not going to get into the details of here. I just will tell you that they did not have anesthetic at the time, and she had an entire one of her breasts removed. And that's all I'm going to tell you. You can read into it if you want. I don't recommend it. And to get the cliff notes, if you watch the John Adams miniseries that came out about a decade ago on HBO, they show the scene. There's a lot wrong with their scene, like it's Benjamin Rush doing the operation, and he was in Philly and not Massachusetts. It's actually one of the few scenes that they're really wrong about, but they don't show you what's happening, but they let you know what's going on. So this one's going to be really short because I didn't want to get too into that. She was known for being brave, and apparently she didn't cry out during the procedure, which everyone was very impressed with. And then she goes back home. She recovers for a while and then goes back home to central New York and then notices more tumors and goes back. And a year later, dies anyway, which is super beat. So because of that, we're going to go back to William Henry Harrison for a second here. That's Abigail Nabby Smith. Sorry to be a bummer. Most of the Adams children, other than the one that becomes president, most of the Adams children suffer tough lives. I have links to some of them in that article. You know, another one of John Adams' sons died of alcoholism when he was president. Another one died later. Yada, yada, yada. So let me take a sip of this. Let's have some fun and leave the revolution for a little bit to end tonight. Because we're right at an hour. So, William Henry Harrison's lineage. William Henry Harrison, as I said, his father, Benjamin Harrison V, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And his grandson, Benjamin Harrison, more than 5, I don't know. There's probably other ones in there. I'd say 6 to 8. His father was a signer of the Declaration. He was president. And his grandson was president of the United States of America. He's the one who's bookended by 2 Grover Clevelands on each side in the late 1800s. I'm under the impression they are the only grandfather-grandson pair of United States presidents. He has... so there's one name that's missing there. His father was a signer of the Declaration. Wait, over here. Father was a signer of the Declaration. He was a president, blank, and his grandson was a president. Well, what happened to his son? Well, his son, whose name eludes me right now, I think it was Joseph Harrison. Harrison's son. I don't know. But what I do know about is it. Okay, there's a few here. Is it John Scott? I think it's John Scott Harrison. Yes. So his son, one of his many sons, would eventually pass away. He was briefly a member of the House of Representatives, leading up to the Civil War. Again, his dad was president, and his son was president. Sorry, I got a little twist around. Benjamin Harrison's son, who himself would have a son that was president, would die. And they were very afraid of his body being snatched because they were still doing body snatchings at this time. Now, let me get this straight. So, they locked his body in. They buried it extra deep, covered it in cement, and had people standing on guard. And then, one of their friends' bodies was also snatched. So, they went to find that friend's body at the University of... I don't remember which one. They went to find the friend's body at a college. And they walked in, and there was a body there, and it was his son, John Scott Harrison's body, who they thought was buried under cement and had a guard standing by it. That's how good the body snatchers went. And what's really interesting is that was the end of body snatching in the United States. Because suddenly they were like, whoa, the grandson of a president? I mean, his own son, Benjamin Harrison, would be president, 3 years later. Like, this dude's starting his campaign for president, and his father's body is snatched? No, rich people don't get snatched. That's a poor people thing. And because of the outcry, that's when they started making laws across the United States to really halt the practice of body snatching and to really attempt to get people to donate their bodies, and additionally to donate the bodies of pretty much any unclaimed body. It was really a big move to help, because the thing is, medical universities needed the bodies to teach students about medicine. So, now if we go through a different line of sons, William Henry Harrison, this guy, had a different son when he was very old. And then that son also had a son when he was very old. One of the guy who got body snatch's brothers was very old and had a son. And then that guy also had a son when he was very old. I got lost in the line. He had a son when he was really old. That son had another son when he was really old. That son, his grandson, died this year. Yeah. This year. That's what Matt was referencing. This guy, president in 1840, 180 years ago, his grandson just died this year. They were, how do you say, fertile? Is that the right word? And also, I do want to note one last thing about Harrison, and then we're going to go for today. William Henry Harrison is always accused of dying from pneumonia. He did give the longest presidential speech in history, and it was on a very cold day in March, which used to be when people were inaugurated. And then he did die just a month later. And he's often accused of saying, brah, I'm a tough guy and I'm going to stand out in the cold even though I'm too old to stand in the cold, and then he gets pneumonia and dies from standing in the cold giving his speech. That's been a long-standing rumor for a long time, but research has indicated over the last few years that no, they didn't used to know a whole lot about where you put septic tanks compared to where you put your drinking water. And it seems that the first, half of America's presidents were drinking poopy water. every day. It seems to be why, was it Hayes, I believe, died in office from an unexplained disease? It seems like the poopy water got him too. And it wasn't until the early 1900s where they said, hey guys, maybe, just maybe, we stopped drinking the poopy water. Now, to be fair, it wasn't like they were putting feces directly in the poopy water. Like, they just didn't have the septic drainage far enough away from the well. And again, also to be fair, they didn't know about disease and germ theory until the early 1900s, which didn't help. This is also about the same time where, doctors would stop taking their hands from dead bodies and putting them into pregnant women to deliver babies. This is about the time where they started washing their hands on their way from the cadaver to the baby. So, just to put some perspective on that. An interesting note, if you guys want to read a book that's amazing, that is not relevant at all to the founding, but since we're here, and I never get to talk about it, there's a book called The President is a Sick Man. And it's about, I think it's William, is it McKinley? Oh man, I can't even remember. And it's not going to be behind me. These are all Rev War books. Oh, is it about McKinley? I'm going to look it up for you guys. And I know you're thinking, like, why is he recommending a book when he doesn't even remember? Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland, who was president before and after Benjamin Harrison. Not this one, Benjamin Harrison. Why can't he even remember the president? Well, the president doesn't much matter. It's about the fact that he used to smoke cigars and he got cancer in his mouth. And they did a revolutionary surgery by removing the tumor from his mouth. But they didn't want to let people know that he had a tumor in his mouth because the health of the president literally reflected the health of the country. And if everyone found out he was sick, the country would tank at a time where having panics, as they called them at the time, happened. And so they actually take McKinley out onto a ship in the Long Island Sound, and they have this revolutionary, super sketchy operation to remove the tumor on water that's floating at a time where, and the doctor doing it was this guy who was like, no one really liked in the medical field because he kept saying, you guys should wash your hands. And they were like, no, forget you, man. So if you're interested in not reading about the American Revolution and checking out it's pretty short and it's a super easy read. The President is a Sick Man. Like, check it out. It's so many fun things going. It's one of those books. It's like Unlikely Allies, where it's like it's too good to be true. But speaking of too good to be true, we are an hour over, and I already started late. So I wanted to say thank you to you guys. Definitely hit like on your way out. You are the best friends in the whole wide world, and I am going to call it the word. The word that I'm supposed to say is be forgetful. Oh.